You think African American lunches were just sandwiches and leftovers? Think again. Black kitchens packed midday meals so filling they powered workers and children through long days. Let's dig into 60 African American lunches from the 1960s and 70s that have disappeared. Red beans and rice plates were slow-cooked comfort served in generous scoops. The beans simmered for hours with bits of ham bone, garlic, and bay leaf, thickening into a creamy stew that filled the air with promise. Served over rice, it was a meal that could feed a family for days, stretching every dollar without losing flavor. It was lunch, dinner, and sometimes breakfast too, a dish that fit every moment of need. In black kitchens from Louisiana to Chicago, red beans and rice were symbols of home. They carried the warmth of Sunday into every weekday that followed. Each spoonful was hearty, humble, and healing. Red beans and rice were not just sustenance. They were a story of patience, pride, and the unshakable rhythm of survival. Families would gather around the pot, stirring slowly and seasoning by feel, passing down the same technique through generations. Sometimes a splash of hot sauce or a side of cornbread joined the plate, turning simplicity into perfection. It was food that taught endurance and grace, a dish that said, "We will make it through." Red beans and rice proved that faith and flavor could coexist, simmered together in one pot until they became a way of life. Fried croker fish sandwiches were a common lunch in coastal African American communities where small fish were plentiful and affordable. Croker fish were cleaned, seasoned, dredged in cornmeal, and fried whole until crisp. They were slipped between slices of bread, sometimes with onion or mustard for extra flavor. The bones were small enough to eat around easily, making the sandwich both convenient and filling. Housewives relied on it because croker was cheap, quick to fry, and satisfying for both children and adults. The sandwiches were portable, making them ideal for workers carrying lunch to the fields, docks, or factories. They carried the taste of the sea into everyday life, celebrating both local resources and frugality. Today, fried croker sandwiches have mostly vanished from tables, replaced by other fish options, but they once stood as a symbol of how African American kitchens turned abundance into sustenance, making something ordinary into something sustaining. Molasses glazed chicken wings gave lunch boxes and picnic tables a sticky sweetness that clung to every fingertip. The wings were marinated overnight in a blend of dark molasses, garlic, and a touch of ground mustard before being baked until the glaze turned glossy and caramelized. As they roasted, the molasses thickened into a deep, amber coating that locked in the juices and perfumed the kitchen with a warm, almost smoky scent. Families packed these wings in foil for school lunches or road trips, where they stayed moist and flavorful even when served at room temperature. Children loved the candy-like glaze, while adults appreciated the subtle spice and satisfying chew. In many African American households of the 1970s, these wings became a dependable treat for church picnics and weekend outings, offering the perfect mix of frugality and indulgence. Eating them meant licking every finger clean and reaching for one more piece even when the basket seemed empty, a memory that lingers long after the last bite. Rice and gravy plates were the leftover miracle of Sunday dinners. When the roast was gone, the gravy stayed, a pot of flavor too precious to waste. Poured over warm rice, it became a whole new meal, rich and soothing. The taste was deep and slow, made from drippings, onions, and patience. It stretched one meal into three, a small victory in homes where nothing was thrown away. The smell filled kitchens with familiarity, that savory perfume of comfort and continuity. Children learned to love it early, scraping plates clean to catch every last drop. For working families, rice and gravy were a reminder that resourcefulness could taste like luxury. It was not just food. It was a memory reheated, a symbol of care and cleverness. Rice and gravy plates were proof that love could be poured, ladled, and served one spoonful at a time. Okra and rice patties were a clever way to combine two staples into a dish that felt both filling and practical. Leftover cooked rice was mixed with chopped okra, seasoned with onion or pepper, and shaped into patties that were fried until crisp. The texture balanced the softness of rice with the chew of okra, producing something that could be eaten by hand or served on a plate. Housewives liked the recipe because it stretched leftovers into another meal, ensuring nothing went to waste. Children sometimes disliked the sliminess of okra, but the frying helped disguise it, making the patties more appealing. Adults appreciated that it was hearty enough to stand alone yet versatile enough to pair with greens or beans. Okra and rice patties reflected both thrift and creativity, proving how African American kitchens worked with what was available. Though rarely made today, they once symbolized survival cooking that turned plain staples into a lunch with flavor and substance. Molasses glazed chicken wings gave lunch boxes and picnic tables a sticky sweetness that clung to every fingertip. The wings were marinated overnight in a blend of dark molasses, garlic, and a touch of ground mustard before being baked until the glaze turned glossy and caramelized. As they roasted, the molasses thickened into a deep, amber coating that locked in the juices and perfumed the kitchen with a warm, almost smoky scent. Families packed these wings in foil for school lunches or road trips, where they stayed moist and flavorful even when served at room temperature. Children loved the candy-like glaze, while adults appreciated the subtle spice and satisfying chew. In many African American households of the 1970s, these wings became a dependable treat for church picnics and weekend outings, offering the perfect mix of frugality and indulgence. Eating them meant licking every finger clean and reaching for one more piece even when the basket seemed empty, a memory that lingers long after the last bite. Okra and shrimp jambalaya offered a one-pot celebration of land and sea that carried the essence of Louisiana. Long grain rice simmered in a fragrant stock made from shrimp shells, absorbing layers of garlic, onion, and green pepper. Plump shrimp joined slices of spicy sausage, while fresh okra thickened the dish and added a subtle, grassy flavor unique to Southern cooking. The pot was stirred slowly, allowing every ingredient to meld into a harmonious whole that needed no side dish to complete it. Families gathered around large pots of this jambalaya at church picnics, harvest festivals, and simple Sunday lunches, savoring the deep aroma that drifted across backyards. Grandparents remember how each spoonful offered the perfect balance of spice, smoke, and sweetness from the sea. It was a recipe passed down through generations, holding the history of African, French, and Spanish influences in every grain of rice, and it remains a beloved memory of community and celebration even as it grows rare on modern tables. Black-eyed pea soup was one of the most dependable winter meals because peas were cheap, nutritious, and able to stretch across multiple days. Mothers cooked them slowly with onions, seasoning, and scraps of bone or fat to deepen the flavor. As the peas broke down, the soup thickened into something hearty enough to anchor a dinner. Children gathered around the table with cornbread ready to dunk into their bowls. The soup warmed cold hands and filled hungry stomachs, offering comfort in every spoonful. Some families added rice to stretch it even further, turning one pot into several meals. The longer it simmered, the more the flavors blended together. Black-eyed pea soup did more than feed a family. It kept hope alive on the hardest days. Black-eyed pea soup was survival on the stove, steady and reassuring. Sweet potato pound cake. Slices brought a touch of homemade dessert to school cafeterias and factory lunchrooms, wrapping the flavor of autumn into every moist crumb. Mashed sweet potatoes blended with butter, sugar, and warm spices created a dense, tender cake that stayed fresh for days. Bakers poured the batter into loaf pans, letting the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg fill the kitchen as the cake baked to a deep golden hue. Once cooled, thick slices were wrapped in wax paper and packed into lunchboxes where they held their shape without crumbling. In the 1970s, these slices became a beloved treat for children and adults who wanted something sweet that traveled well and felt like a gift from home. They paired perfectly with a cup of coffee or a simple glass of milk, offering comfort with every bite. Each slice carried the memory of family kitchens where ovens worked steadily and sweet potatoes brought both nutrition and pure happiness to the middle of an ordinary day. Tell us which lunch you're craving, drop a comment, hit like, and subscribe so we can keep the 70s flavor party rolling. Fried cabbage and onion sandwiches were a lunch that blended thrift with bold flavor. Cabbage and onions were sliced thin, sautéed in fat until browned, and then layered between slices of bread, sometimes with mustard or vinegar for extra bite. The result was savory, filling, and inexpensive, perfect for families looking to stretch vegetables into a meal. Housewives liked the recipe because both cabbage and onions were cheap, kept well, and cooked down into something hearty. Children might not have loved the strong taste, but adults valued the way it satisfied hunger without needing meat. It was a practical lunch for field hands, school children, or anyone who needed something portable and quick. Fried cabbage and onion sandwiches reflected the resilience of kitchens that turned simple ingredients into nourishment. Though rarely eaten today, they once carried both flavor and tradition, proving that even the humblest foods could be transformed into something worth remembering on the lunch table. Leftover smothered pork chops on white bread were the kind of lunch that tasted even better the next day. Packed in foil or wax paper, the tender meat soaked the bread with thick, peppery gravy until it became one with it. Cold or slightly warm, it didn't matter. The flavor was deep, comforting, and rich with memory. Families would save the last few chops from Sunday dinner and stretch them through Monday lunches, knowing that no drop of gravy should go to waste. The scent alone could stop conversation, that unmistakable mix of onion, fat, and love. It was the food of working people who believed in never throwing away what was hard-earned. Sometimes a slice of tomato or a drizzle of hot sauce joined in, turning a simple sandwich into something close to divine. It wasn't fancy, but it was soulful, a reminder that leftovers weren't just what remained, they were what endured. Leftover smothered pork chops on white bread carried the wisdom of generations who knew that comfort could travel anywhere, even between two slices. Hoppin' John salad turned a beloved New Year's tradition into a dish perfect for warm afternoons when a heavy meal would not do. Black-eyed peas were cooked until tender, then chilled and tossed with diced bell pepper, celery, and a gentle splash of apple cider vinegar that gave a bright tang. Cooked rice cooled alongside the peas and soaked up the dressing, making every spoonful light but still satisfying. Chopped green onions and a pinch of cayenne added a subtle kick that reminded everyone of the dish's southern roots. In the 1970s, families made large bowls early in the day so it would be cold and flavorful by lunchtime, perfect for picnics, school lunches, or quiet moments on shaded porches. It was a salad that balanced tradition and convenience, carrying the good luck symbolism of the original recipe into everyday life. A scoop of Hoppin' John salad offered cool relief from summer heat while preserving the flavor of a classic that never felt out of season, no matter how high the sun climbed. Creole crab cakes brought the flavor of the Gulf Coast to kitchen tables far from the docks. Fresh or freshly picked crab meat was mixed with breadcrumbs, diced celery, green onions, and a touch of spicy cayenne before being shaped into small patties. These were pan-fried in butter or lard until the outside turned a deep golden brown while the inside stayed tender and sweet. Families near Louisiana or along the coast prized this lunch when the day's catch was good, but even inland cooks used canned crab when fresh seafood was scarce. The gentle heat of the spices paired perfectly with the natural sweetness of the crab, making each bite a small celebration of coastal heritage and African-influenced seasoning. Served on soft rolls or beside a pile of greens, these crab cakes transformed a simple midday meal into something memorable. Elders who grew up with this dish often recall the sound of sizzling crab cakes as the happiest soundtrack of long summer afternoons. Sweet potato and pecan salad brought a gentle sweetness to crowded potluck tables while keeping every bite refreshing and light. Cubes of roasted sweet potato were chilled and folded into a dressing made with homemade mayonnaise, apple cider vinegar, and a drizzle of local honey for brightness. Toasted pecans added a buttery crunch that played against the creamy dressing and the soft potatoes. Bits of celery and a touch of fresh parsley gave a faint herbal note that lifted the whole salad beyond the ordinary. This dish traveled well in big glass bowls wrapped with foil, making it perfect for church picnics, neighborhood reunions, and summer weddings. In the 1970s, it was a common sight at outdoor gatherings where cooks wanted something special yet practical to feed a crowd. Every forkful offered a balance of sweet, nutty, and tangy flavors that surprised anyone expecting a simple potato salad. It stood as a reminder that Southern cooks could transform familiar ingredients into something completely unexpected and deeply memorable. Grease bread sandwiches were a no-frills lunch that made the most of every scrap left from cooking. After frying meat like bacon or salt pork, the leftover drippings were spread onto bread, sometimes sprinkled with a little salt or pepper. The result was a sandwich that was greasy, salty, and filling enough to tide someone over until dinner. Housewives relied on it because it wasted nothing, stretching even the smallest amount of meat into another meal. Children sometimes enjoyed it for its richness, though it was not always seen as a treat, while adults accepted it as a quick way to satisfy hunger. Grease bread sandwiches reflected the wartime and Depression-era mentality of using every resource to its fullest. Though far from glamorous, they carried both nourishment and necessity in their simplicity. Today they have nearly disappeared, but once they were a symbol of thrift and survival in African American kitchens. Ham hock beans and cornbread were the meal that filled bellies and hearts at once. Dry beans soaked overnight came to life in a pot of simmering ham hocks, onions, and bay leaves. The smoky aroma wrapped around every corner of the house, promising satisfaction long before the first spoonful. Served with a wedge of hot cornbread, it was food that stayed with you through the longest day. This dish didn't belong to luxury. It belonged to the hard-working, the faithful, and the patient. Every bean was soft, every bite of ham rich with flavor earned over hours. It was a dish made with time and trust, proof that good things waited for those who tended the pot. Families gathered around small tables with big appetites, passing cornbread and gratitude in equal measure. Ham hock beans and cornbread were the taste of sustenance, soul, and the art of stretching little into plenty. Turtle stew with dumplings was a rural dish that reflected both necessity and ingenuity. Turtle meat, often from snapping turtles caught in rivers or ponds, was simmered slowly with vegetables until tender. Dumplings made from flour and water were dropped into the broth, creating a hearty stew that could feed many mouths. Housewives valued the dish because turtles were free to catch and stretched into a full meal when paired with dumplings. Children were sometimes hesitant about the idea of eating turtle, but the savory stew usually won them over. Adults appreciated its richness and the way it warmed and satisfied, especially during lean seasons. Turtle stew with dumplings represented survival cooking, where every resource from the land or water could become nourishment. Today, it is almost entirely forgotten. But once it was a vital dish that showed how African American families combined ingenuity and resourcefulness with tradition and need at the lunch table. Blackened shrimp lettuce wraps offered a fast and flavorful Gulf Coast lunch that felt light yet full of character. Fresh shrimp were coated with a bold mix of paprika, cayenne, garlic powder, and black pepper, then seared in a hot cast-iron skillet until the spices formed a smoky crust. Instead of bread, large, crisp lettuce leaves held the shrimp along with a spoonful of diced tomatoes and a drizzle of lemon butter, keeping the meal cool and refreshing. These wraps were perfect for hot afternoons when no one wanted to turn on the oven or sit down to a heavy plate of food. Street vendors in coastal towns often sold them wrapped in parchment for easy eating while walking near the water. In the 1970s, they represented a fresh take on seafood lunches, showing how tradition and innovation could meet in one simple dish. Every bite brought the taste of the ocean and the heat of southern spice, a combination that lingered pleasantly long after the last wrap disappeared. Molasses glazed sweet potato wedges offered a gentle sweetness that brightened even the most ordinary midday meal. Fresh sweet potatoes were sliced into thick wedges, brushed with sorghum or dark molasses, and roasted until the natural sugars caramelized into a sticky glaze. A pinch of cinnamon and a splash of apple cider vinegar balanced the rich sweetness with a subtle tang, filling the kitchen with a warm autumn aroma. Families prized this dish because it required little more than a backyard harvest of potatoes and a jar of pantry syrup, yet tasted indulgent enough for Sunday gatherings. Grandparents recall how the edges crisped to a delicate chew while the centers stayed soft and almost creamy, making each bite a small celebration. These wedges were often paired with fried chicken or simply served alongside a bowl of beans and greens, adding both color and comfort to the plate. Even today, the memory of that molasses shine and the slow roasting smell can bring a wave of nostalgia to anyone who grew up with Southern kitchens. Rice with pan-dripping gravy was the meal that proved nothing in the kitchen ever went to waste. After cooking meat, mothers saved the browned bits and leftover grease from the bottom of the skillet. With a bit of flour, water, and patient stirring, those drippings transformed into a smooth, savory gravy that tasted like far more than it cost. Poured over fresh rice, the gravy turned a plain bowl into a full dinner that kept children satisfied for hours. The smell of the gravy thickening was enough to bring everyone to the table early. Some nights, mothers added onions or a pinch of seasoning if they had it, deepening the flavor even more. Other nights, it was nothing but drippings and water, yet still tasted like comfort. Children learned early that gravy night meant nobody would go hungry. It was simple, filling, and reliable, the kind of meal that made hard days feel a little easier. Rice with pan-dripping gravy was the quiet hero of many 1960s kitchens. Collard green sandwiches were the definition of thrift turned into comfort. Cooked low with fatback or smoked turkey, the greens soaked up flavor until every leaf was silky and seasoned deep. When money ran low or bread was scarce, those greens found their way between leftover biscuits or cornbread slices. Steam rose as you bit in, a mix of salt, spice, and love. It was not fancy, but it was filling and full of meaning. Families who could not afford meat still tasted richness in every bite. The juice, called Potlikker, dripped down fingers and onto plates, too precious to waste. Every mouthful carried generations of resourcefulness, the quiet art of making do and making good. Collard green sandwiches were not about excess. They were about endurance, flavor born from necessity, and the memory of hands that turned hunger into something worth remembering. Some added a slice of onion or a smear of hot sauce, making every sandwich their own. Others packed them for fieldwork, the warmth holding steady long after morning. The smell alone spoke of family kitchens where stories simmered as slow as the greens themselves. Collard green sandwiches were proof that love, not wealth, made a meal worth having. Salt pork and cabbage skillets were hearty lunches that filled tables with warmth and thrift. Chopped salt pork was fried until browned. Then shredded cabbage was added to the pan and cooked down until tender. The pork fat flavored the cabbage, transforming a simple vegetable into a savory meal. Sometimes onions or potatoes were added to stretch it further, but even on its own, it was filling and satisfying. Housewives valued the recipe because salt pork was inexpensive, long-lasting, and easy to store, while cabbage was available year-round and cheap. Children often found the flavor strong, but adults embraced it as comfort food that reminded them of both thrift and tradition. It was a dish that fed large families with very little cost, making it practical during hard times. Today, salt pork and cabbage skillets are rarely remembered, but once they represented resilience, creativity, and the ability to turn scraps into sustaining meals. Hot water. Cornbread sliders brought a playful twist to a Southern classic by turning humble fried cornbread into a handheld sandwich. The batter was made with boiling water poured over seasoned cornmeal, stirred until thick, and shaped into small patties that crisped beautifully in hot oil. Once golden, the cornbread rounds were split and stuffed with leftover greens, slices of smoked meat, or even a smear of homemade relish. These sliders became a clever way to stretch leftovers while delivering a satisfying crunch and warm corn flavor in every bite. They were portable enough for school lunches, factory shifts, or church outings, and families loved how quickly they could be made with ingredients already on hand. In the 1970s, you could find them at potlucks or tucked into picnic baskets, where they stood out for both creativity and taste. Simple, filling, and full of history, these sliders proved that the best lunches often start with the simplest traditions made fresh again. Baked macaroni pie stood proudly on lunch tables across the South as a dish that blended practicality with celebration. Elbow macaroni was boiled until tender, then mixed with sharp cheddar, eggs, and a splash of evaporated milk to create a custard-like filling. The mixture was poured into a buttered dish, sprinkled with more cheese, and baked until the top formed a golden crust that crackled under a spoon. This was not the creamy stovetop macaroni of today, but a firm, sliceable pie that could be packed into lunch pails or served at church gatherings. Grandparents treasured how it provided protein and comfort in one affordable dish, turning a handful of pantry staples into something that felt like a feast. Each slice held the smoky bite of cheddar and the richness of baked custard, satisfying even the hungriest farmhands after long hours in the fields. It remains a beloved memory of Sunday suppers and community celebrations, a dish whose scent alone could draw neighbors to the table with eager smiles and ready forks. Pinto beans with ham hock were the dependable weekday pot that never failed a family trying to stretch $1 across an entire week. Dried beans cost next to nothing, and mothers knew how to turn them into something hearty with nothing more than time and a bit of skill. The beans were soaked overnight, so they would soften evenly, then rinsed and poured into a heavy pot early the next morning. A single ham hock was added, sometimes stripped bare from earlier meals, but still carrying enough bone and fat to give the entire pot depth. As everything simmered slowly, the beans broke down into a creamy texture, absorbing the smoky, salty flavor of the hock. Children drifted toward the kitchen as the smell spread through the house, thick and comforting, a reminder that there would be enough to eat. Mothers would stir the pot gently, tasting and adjusting until it reached that perfect balance of tender beans and flavorful broth. Served with cornbread or rice, the pot could last for days, reheating into something even better each time. Pinto beans with ham hock were more than just food. They were security. They were warmth on the coldest days and reassurance during the hardest weeks. Hot water cornbread with molasses was the taste of country simplicity, fried golden and dipped in sweetness. Cornmeal mixed with boiling water formed quick patties, cooked in hot grease until crisp on the outside and soft within. Drizzled with molasses, it was a meal that straddled breakfast and lunch, satisfying both hunger and memory. It was quick to make, filling and rich with flavor. Field hands packed it in cloth wraps. Children ate it warm off the stove. It was humble food but deeply loved, proof that care could turn the plainest pantry into a feast. Each bite carried history, from wooden spoons to cast iron pans. Hot water cornbread with molasses was simplicity perfected, the golden taste of home that never needed more than what it already had. Fried pig ear sandwiches were a lunch that turned overlooked parts of the hog into something flavorful and memorable. Pig ears were cleaned, boiled until tender, then fried until crisp on the outside while still chewy within. The ears were tucked into slices of white bread with mustard or hot sauce for sharpness. Housewives liked the recipe because it used cuts of meat that were inexpensive and often discarded, making them an affordable protein source. Children sometimes struggled with the chewy texture, but adults embraced the flavor and thrift. The sandwich was portable, easy to prepare, and filling enough to carry someone through the day. It reflected a tradition of honoring the whole hog, ensuring nothing was wasted. Fried pig ear sandwiches have nearly vanished today, but once they stood as a symbol of practicality and heritage, reminding families of how resourcefulness turned even the humblest parts of the animal into sustaining meals. Ham hock and collard soup cups were the kind of lunch that drew people from every direction the moment the aroma began drifting out of church basements and city markets. Collard greens simmered for hours with smoked ham hocks until the broth turned deep and flavorful, rich with a savory balance of salt and smoke. Volunteers would ladle the steaming soup into sturdy styrofoam cups that fit perfectly in a pair of hands, chilled by winter air. Each sip warmed the body and offered a taste of the kind of care that only long simmering can create. These cups of soup were inexpensive, filling, and easy to carry, making them a favorite at fundraisers where neighbors swapped stories while standing in line. In the 1970s, it was not unusual to see whole families gathered on the church lawn enjoying this simple comfort before heading back to work or school. It was food built from patience and generosity, a recipe that gave as much warmth to the spirit as it did to the stomach. Fried oyster po' boys brought the vibrant taste of the Gulf Coast to African American lunch tables where seafood was both livelihood and celebration. Fresh oysters were dredged in seasoned cornmeal until every surface was coated in a golden armor that crackled when it met the sizzling lard of a cast-iron skillet. French bread loaves, crisp outside and airy inside, were sliced open to cradle the oysters along with sliced tomatoes and shredded lettuce for a cooling crunch. The signature remoulade sauce, a blend of mustard, paprika, and a hint of vinegar, soaked into the warm bread and tied every flavor together with a gentle tang. Street vendors and small cafes along Louisiana's coast became famous for these sandwiches because they transformed the morning's catch into a hearty portable lunch that fishermen and dock workers could grab between shifts. Grandparents still talk about the smell of frying oysters drifting through open-air markets and the thrill of biting into a sandwich that captured the ocean in every mouthful. The memory lingers long after the oysters are gone. Cracklin cornbread was a rich, hearty version of cornbread made with leftover pork cracklings that added flavor and calories to an otherwise simple dish. Mothers mixed the cracklings into the batter, folding them in until each scoop promised a bit of salty crunch. As the cornbread baked, the smell filled the house, making children eager for the first hot slice. The cracklings gave every bite texture and depth, turning ordinary cornbread into something more sustaining. Served with beans, greens, or simply on its own, Cracklin cornbread helped families stay full through long evenings. Children especially loved the crispy edges where the cracklings peeked through. Mothers relied on it during the cold months because it paired well with almost anything and always lasted until the next day. It was resourcefulness turned into tradition. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches were childhood's sticky treasure, the kind of meal made with what was in the pantry. A spoonful of peanut butter, thick and nutty, spread across white bread before a drizzle of syrup turned it into magic. Pressed together, it stuck to the roof of your mouth and your heart. It was sweet, simple, and quick, a lunch for busy mothers and hungry kids before packaged snacks ever existed. Every bite was comfort, sugar and salt dancing together. It was cheap, but it felt rich, messy, but it felt right. Some added bananas, others dusted it with sugar, but the essence stayed the same. Love made visible between two slices of bread. That sandwich carried children through long afternoons of play and elders through quiet mornings of reflection. Peanut butter and syrup sandwiches were joy made easy, the taste of home on even the hardest day. Stuffed collard rolls were an inventive lunch that transformed everyday greens into something hearty and memorable. Large collard leaves were blanched until pliable, then filled with a mixture of rice, onions, and small bits of pork or ham for seasoning. The rolls were tied or folded neatly, then simmered in broth until tender. This dish stretched small amounts of meat across many portions, making it economical yet satisfying. Housewives appreciated the recipe because collards were abundant and inexpensive, while rice added bulk and nutrition. Children sometimes resisted the leafy greens, but usually enjoyed the savory rice filling inside. Adults admired the way this meal turned familiar garden produce into something that felt both substantial and comforting. Stuffed collard rolls reflected both thrift and creativity, carrying influences from African, Southern, and even immigrant cooking traditions. Today, they are seldom seen, but at one time, stuffed collard rolls were a proud symbol of resourcefulness in African-American lunch tables. Okra and tomato stew with rice was the dependable pot of comfort simmering on many stovetops when the noon bell rang. Fresh okra pods thickened the stew naturally, while ripe tomatoes brought bright acidity that balanced the earthiness of onions, garlic, and bell pepper. A splash of homemade stock or even plain water was enough to create a rich broth once the vegetables released their juices. Served over a mound of steamed white rice, this dish carried the flavors of the Gullah Geechee coast into urban kitchens across the country. The gentle heat of cayenne or a pinch of smoked paprika added depth without overpowering the vegetables. Families loved it because it could feed many mouths from a single pot, staying warm for hours and tasting even better as the day went on. In the 1970s, it was common to see neighbors ladle generous helpings into bowls for visiting friends or for anyone who had come to lend a hand with household chores. Peanut butter and sorghum syrup sandwiches gave children a sweet reward that parents could still afford when sugar prices were climbing. Sorghum syrup, dark and rich with a subtle caramel note, spread smoothly over fresh bread and mingled with creamy peanut butter for a sticky treat that clung to fingers and hearts alike. This sandwich was packed into lunch pails headed for school buses and factory floors, offering long-lasting energy with ingredients that stayed fresh without refrigeration. Sorghum had deep roots in southern farming, and in the 1970s it remained a pantry staple for many African-American households that valued both tradition and thrift. The simple act of drizzling syrup over peanut butter turned a basic sandwich into something special, with each bite carrying a sweet depth far beyond plain jelly. Children traded halves with friends, and adults often sneaked a second sandwich for themselves, proof that the best lunches were not always the fanciest ones. Saltfish cakes carried the flavor of the sea into inland kitchens and proved that preserved ingredients could create unforgettable lunches. Dried salt cod was soaked overnight until tender, then flaked into a bowl of mashed potatoes, chopped onions, and fresh parsley before being shaped into small patties. Each cake was pan-fried in hot lard until the outside turned a deep golden brown and the inside stayed soft and briny. Families valued these cakes for their long shelf life and the ability to travel well without refrigeration, making them ideal for picnics, fieldwork, or school lunches. Grandparents remember how the salty aroma filled the house as the cake sizzled in the skillet and how a squeeze of lemon or a spoonful of homemade relish brightened every bite. Served with simple greens or a slice of cornbread, these fish cakes turned humble pantry staples into something both hearty and elegant. They remain a symbol of resourcefulness and coastal tradition, a recipe that brought the ocean's taste to every table no matter how far from the shore. White beans with fatback were another long-lasting pot that carried families through the hardest weeks. The beans were soaked, rinsed, and started early in the day. A single piece of fatback was added, providing salt and richness that flavored the entire pot. As the beans cooked, they softened into something creamy and satisfying. Children loved dipping cornbread into the thick broth, soaking up all the flavor. The pot often lasted several meals, reheating well and growing deeper in taste each time. Mothers sometimes added onions or garlic if they had a bit left, but even plain, the beans tasted hearty. This meal did not require much money, only time, patience, and skill. In cold months, the steam from the pot fogged up windows and warmed the kitchen before anyone even sat down to eat. White beans with fatback were survival food that tasted like comfort and care. Canned Vienna sausages and crackers were the working person's quick salvation. Tiny pink sausages, slick with brine, were popped from tins and eaten with saltine crackers straight from the sleeve. They were portable, cheap, and oddly satisfying, with a flavor that felt like nostalgia and necessity rolled together. Lunchboxes and glove compartments alike held cans of Vienna sausages, ready for when hunger came knocking. Some added hot sauce or mustard, others just kept it plain. It was the kind of meal that didn't need heating or ceremony, just an appetite and a bit of gratitude. In every bite was the taste of practicality, of getting by with what was there. Vienna sausages and crackers were proof that dignity could live in simplicity even when times were hard. They fit perfectly into the lives of those who had no time to waste, who measured meals not in courses but in endurance. The snap of the tin lid breaking open was a familiar sound, a small relief in a long day. You could taste the effort, the resilience, and the quiet pride in making something so humble matter. Vienna sausages were more than a meal. They were the taste of perseverance served one bite at a time. Giblet stew over rice was a lunchtime staple that used parts of the chicken often discarded or overlooked. Giblets, hearts, gizzards, and livers were simmered with onions, garlic, and simple seasonings until tender, then poured over rice for a filling plate. The stew was deeply savory, inexpensive, and stretched easily to feed large families. Housewives liked the dish because nothing went to waste, and even a single chicken could provide multiple meals when every part was used. Children sometimes balked at the idea of giblets, but the flavor was rich enough to win them over, especially when smothered in gravy. Adults valued it for both its thrift and its nourishment, as giblets were dense in protein and iron. It was the kind of food that turned necessity into comfort, and it stood as a reminder that creativity often came from constraint. Today, giblet stew is rare at lunch tables, but once it represented survival and sustenance. Spicy mustard. Greens, flatbreads gave weekday lunches a burst of heat and a hint of smoky bitterness that only well-cooked greens can provide. Dough was mixed and rolled thin before being pan-griddled until small brown spots appeared, filling the kitchen with the aroma of warm wheat. Meanwhile, mustard greens were sautéed with garlic, onion, and crushed red pepper until tender but still vibrant in color. The greens were then tucked inside the flatbread and folded into a neat pocket that could be eaten on the move without a plate or utensils. These flatbreads were especially popular with workers needing a quick meal that traveled well, and families often made extra to freeze for busy days. In the 1970s, they appeared at community fairs and church gatherings where the smell of sizzling bread and spicy greens drew long lines. Each bite carried the bold flavor of southern fields and the resourcefulness of cooks who knew how to turn simple garden harvests into unforgettable lunches that satisfied hunger and sparked conversation alike. Okra cornbread muffins turned a classic southern bread into a vegetable-filled delight that worked perfectly for lunch. Cornmeal batter was prepared with buttermilk, eggs, and a touch of melted butter before being folded with slices of fresh okra. As the muffins baked, the okra softened and released its subtle flavor, adding both moisture and a gentle earthy taste. The golden crust formed on the outside while the inside stayed tender and speckled with green. Families enjoyed these muffins as a portable side to soups, stews, or fried fish, and they quickly became a favorite at picnics and church gatherings. Grandparents recall the excitement of pulling a tray from the oven and seeing the steam rise as the scent of corn and garden vegetables filled the room. These muffins represented the perfect blend of practicality and flavor, turning a simple bread into a showcase for summer harvests. Even today, the memory of biting into a warm okra cornbread muffin brings back the comfort of home and the taste of long-gone family kitchens. Cornbread and Potlikker was a meal born from resourcefulness and cherished for its ability to turn scraps into something deeply nourishing. After collard or turnip greens finished cooking, the leftover broth in the pot was never wasted. That liquid, known as Potlikker, held vitamins, minerals, and the smoky taste of the pork scraps that flavored the greens. Mothers poured the Potlikker into bowls, then crumbled hot cornbread straight into it, letting the bread soak until it softened into a thick, hearty mixture children loved, stirring it together, watching the cornbread break apart and absorb the warm broth. The flavor was rich, salty, and comforting in a way that felt larger than the ingredients themselves. It was a meal that filled empty stomachs, soothed tired bodies, and gave families strength to face the next day. Cornbread and Potlikker was survival wisdom passed down through generations. Potted meat and crackers were the kind of lunch that kept you moving when times were lean. A small tin held a salty, spreadable mixture that could be stretched across stacks of crackers or slices of bread. It was cheap, easy to carry, and filled more bellies than it had any right to. In lunch pails and brown paper bags, it was a steady companion to long days at the mill, in the fields, or on the road. Kids learned to love its sharp, smoky taste, mixed with mustard or relish when there was something extra to spare. It was not fancy, but it was faithful. In every bite was a story of making something from nearly nothing, of dignity and survival. Potted meat and crackers proved that lunch did not need luxury to carry pride. It only needed a little salt, a little grit, and a lot of heart. Some mixed it with chopped onions to make it stretch. Others used it to fill sandwiches that stayed soft until noon. The metallic pop of the tin opening was as familiar as the sound of morning rain, a promise that there would be food that day. It was humble, yes, but it never failed to do its job. Potted meat and crackers were lunch at its simplest and most sincere. Boiled okra and rice bowls were one of the simplest midday meals, stripped down to nothing but essentials. Fresh okra pods were boiled until soft, then spooned generously over hot rice with a little salt and sometimes a splash of hot sauce or vinegar. The texture was slippery and not to everyone's taste, but the dish filled stomachs when little else was available. Housewives leaned on it because okra and rice were cheap and easy to prepare quickly, making it a dependable option when other ingredients were scarce. Children sometimes turned their noses up at the sliminess, but many grew up with it as a familiar part of daily life. Adults appreciated the steady nourishment and the ease of cooking something so simple. Though plain compared to other lunches, boiled okra and rice represented survival and thrift, proving that even the most basic foods could sustain families through lean times. Today it is nearly forgotten, but once it was a staple. Cornbread-crusted catfish fillets carried the essence of Friday fish fries straight into the lunch hour with a crunch that everyone in the neighborhood could hear. Fresh catfish fillets were seasoned with salt, black pepper, and a dusting of cayenne before being dredged in finely ground cornbread crumbs instead of plain cornmeal, which gave them a thicker, sweeter crust. The fillets were fried in cast-iron skillets until the coating turned a warm golden color and the inside stayed moist and flaky. Served between slices of soft white bread or alongside a scoop of slaw, these catfish pieces were as common at church gatherings as they were at family reunions. They were a reminder of the rivers and bayous that had long supplied African-American tables with fresh fish and a taste of home. In the 1970s, the aroma of frying catfish meant neighbors would drop by unannounced, drawn by the smell alone, ready to share stories and a plate without needing an invitation first. Stewed black-eyed peas with ham bone stood as a quiet but powerful example of frugality meeting flavor. A single smoked ham bone, saved from a previous meal, was enough to enrich a whole pot of peas with deep smoky notes. The peas simmered slowly with chopped onions, celery, and a bay leaf until tender, their earthy taste blending perfectly with the broth. Cornbread on the side turned the dish into a complete lunch that filled stomachs and kept energy high through long afternoons of farm work or factory shifts. Grandparents spoke of how nothing was wasted and how even a leftover bone could nourish a large family when treated with patience. Molasses rice was one of the simplest and most reliable meals families leaned on when sugar, meat, and other staples were out of reach. Mothers cooked a pot of plain white rice until it was soft and steaming, then spooned it into bowls while it was still piping hot. A drizzle of molasses, thick, dark, and deeply flavored, was poured over the top, sinking into every grain. The sweetness was rich enough to feel like a treat, even though it came from a bottle that lasted far longer than sugar ever could. Children stirred their bowls until the rice turned a warm caramel color, tasting the comforting blend of sweet and earthy notes. Some added a little butter if the house had any, making it even richer. The dish carried enough calories to keep hunger quiet for hours, which was essential during the toughest weeks. Nothing about it felt cheap to a child. It tasted warm, familiar, and honest. Molasses rice was a bowl of survival disguised as something close to dessert. Collard greens with salt pork were a staple because greens grew cheaply, lasted through cool seasons, and could turn into a full meal when paired with even a small square of salted pork. Mothers washed each leaf carefully, removing grit and stems, then chopped the greens into pieces that wilted beautifully in a simmering pot. The salt pork, often nothing more than a strip of fat with a thin edge of meat, was added for flavor, melting slowly into the broth and transforming the dish into something rich and savory. The greens cooked for hours until they softened and absorbed every bit of seasoning. Children often asked when they would be ready because the smell filled the whole house long before dinner time. When served with cornbread, the greens became a full meal, providing nutrients and warmth in every bite. Mothers loved this dish because it was inexpensive but powerful, feeding bodies and spirits during long, difficult seasons. Collard greens with salt pork were the definition of stretching little into enough. Gula red rice with smoked sausage was a jewel of low-country cooking, blending African culinary roots with the flavors of the American South. Long-grain rice was simmered in a rich tomato base, seasoned with onions, bell peppers, and garlic, then mixed with slices of smoky sausage that lent depth and aroma to every bite. This dish reflected the legacy of the Gula Geechee people, whose rice-growing traditions shaped both culture and cuisine along the coastal Carolinas and Georgia. Families passed down their own variations, each one a reflection of local gardens and personal taste. Served as the main dish or alongside fried fish and greens, Gullah red rice was both everyday food and a celebration dish for church gatherings or community events. The bold red color and fragrant steam signaled comfort and togetherness, qualities that remain strong in memory even as the recipe becomes rarer on modern tables. For many elders, the scent of simmering red rice still carries the warmth of family and shared heritage. Sweet pepper and onion hoagies turned the aroma of a backyard garden into a hearty sandwich that could satisfy the hungriest appetite. Strips of red and green peppers were sautéed slowly in bacon fat until soft and slightly caramelized, then joined by sliced onions that absorbed every drop of smoky flavor. The mixture was piled onto crusty hoagie rolls still warm from the bakery and finished with a swipe of homemade mustard or a thin layer of melted cheese when families had some to spare. Each bite combined sweet vegetables and savory drippings in a way that tasted far richer than the short list of ingredients suggested. These hoagies were sold from small corner stores and food carts in city neighborhoods where the smell of sizzling peppers drew lines down the sidewalk. In the 1970s, they became a quick lunch for workers and students alike, proof that a simple sandwich could feel like a feast. People still talk about the scent that hung in the air long after the last pepper left the pan. Turnip and pea skillets were a flavorful lunch that stretched simple vegetables into something filling and thrifty. Diced turnips were fried with peas, often in pork fat, and seasoned with scraps of ham or onion to deepen the taste. The combination balanced the earthy bite of turnips with the sweetness of peas, creating a dish that was both hearty and satisfying. Housewives liked it because turnips and peas were inexpensive, easy to store, and versatile enough to serve alone or alongside bread. Children sometimes resisted the sharp flavor of turnips, but adults embraced the dish as both practical and nourishing. It was quick to prepare, making it useful for midday meals when time and resources were limited. Turnip and pea skillets carried the spirit of making the most of garden vegetables and stretching every ingredient. Though rarely seen now, they once reflected both thrift and creativity, proving that even modest produce could build a memorable lunch. Boiled peanuts in paper bags were the taste of the South on slow afternoons, salty and tender, a lunch that filled the time as much as the stomach. Green peanuts simmered for hours in salty water until their shells softened and their centers turned creamy, almost buttery. Sold by roadside vendors or cooked in big pots on porches, they were eaten warm, the shells split with teeth, the nuts sucked free with a sigh of satisfaction. For many, they were lunch, snack, and pastime rolled into one. The salt clung to fingertips, the steam carried the scent of soil and rain, and every handful was a connection to home. Workers carried them in brown paper bags, peeling them between jobs or on long drives. They were humble but honest, a food that didn't need to pretend to be more than it was. Boiled peanuts were simplicity done right, proof that the best meals sometimes came from nothing more than time, water, and patience. Pickled okra and cheese sandwiches were an unusual but clever way to combine tangy preserved vegetables with creamy dairy. Crisp pickled okra was sliced lengthwise and layered onto soft white bread with slices of sharp cheese, often cheddar or American. Sometimes a smear of mayonnaise was added to bind it together, creating a sandwich that was salty, tangy, and smooth all at once. Housewives appreciated it because pickled okra could be stored for months and used quickly, while cheese provided both protein and richness. Children often found the pairing strange, but adults enjoyed the sharp flavors that contrasted against soft bread. The sandwich was practical for picnics, lunch boxes, or quick meals at home, requiring almost no preparation. Pickled okra and cheese sandwiches represented the ingenuity of combining preserved foods with fresh staples to stretch resources. Though nearly forgotten today, they once carried novelty and thrift, standing as a reminder of mid-century creativity. Pickled beet and egg salad added bright color to lunch tables and carried a sweet tang that lingered pleasantly on the tongue. Hard-boiled eggs were sliced and combined with sliced beets that had been pickled in vinegar, sugar, and a touch of clove until they turned a deep crimson hue. The eggs absorbed the rosy brine, creating a marbled effect that made every slice look like a work of art. A light dressing of mayonnaise and mustard balanced the acidity and gave the salad a creamy texture that paired well with simple sandwiches or crusty bread. In the 1970s, this dish appeared frequently in school cafeterias and church suppers where its jewel-toned presentation caught every eye. It was economical, nourishing, and striking enough to feel festive without requiring expensive ingredients. Children often remembered the way the beets stained their fingers, a small sign that they had enjoyed something both playful and wholesome. This salad proved that everyday lunches could still deliver a touch of elegance and lasting flavor. Smothered pork chop biscuits combined two beloved Southern comforts into a handheld meal that satisfied even the hungriest midday appetite. Pork chops were seasoned with black pepper, dredged in flour, and pan-fried until the crust turned golden. A quick gravy made from the pan drippings, milk, and a pinch of sage was poured over the chops before they were tucked inside warm, flaky biscuits. The gravy soaked into the bread while keeping the meat tender and juicy, creating a sandwich that tasted like Sunday dinner in portable form. Families often made these in the morning and wrapped them in foil so the biscuits would stay soft until lunchtime. In the 1970s, they were a favorite at roadside diners and church bake sales where the smell of sizzling pork lured people in from blocks away. Each bite offered a harmony of buttery biscuit, savory gravy, and hearty pork that felt both indulgent and perfectly familiar, a reminder of the kitchens where love and practicality met on every plate. Blackstrap molasses, glazed carrots, balanced sweetness and earthiness in a side dish that brightened any lunch plate. Freshly dug carrots were peeled and sliced before being simmered gently with a mixture of blackstrap molasses, butter, and a splash of apple cider vinegar. The natural sugars caramelized as the sauce reduced, coating every piece in a glossy glaze that caught the light. Families loved this dish because it transformed a simple root vegetable into something rich and satisfying without needing expensive spices or heavy meat. The deep, almost smoky sweetness of the molasses paired beautifully with the carrot's natural flavor, making it a favorite alongside cornbread or a bowl of beans. Grandparents remember the smell of slow-cooking carrots filling the air with a warm, comforting aroma that promised a treat even in lean times. This side dish was proof that frugality and flavor could coexist, turning a common vegetable into a centerpiece that everyone looked forward to during those long afternoons around the family table. Tomato gravy over biscuits turned garden produce into a meal that could stand on its own. Ripe tomatoes were chopped and cooked down with onions, garlic, and a touch of black pepper until they formed a thick, peppery sauce. A bit of flour and milk added body, creating a silky gravy that clung to every bite of fresh-baked biscuits. Families prized this dish because it transformed humble ingredients into something hearty and comforting, especially when meat was scarce or too costly. Grandparents remember gathering around the table as the smell of baking biscuits and simmering tomatoes filled the kitchen with warmth. The tang of the tomatoes and the softness of the biscuits created a contrast that felt indulgent despite its simplicity. Often served at midday to fuel long hours of work, this meal became a treasured memory of resourceful cooking and the satisfaction of eating from one's own garden. Even today, the combination of warm biscuits and rich tomato gravy can transport anyone back to those loving kitchens of the past. Boiled corn on the cob with bread was a simple but filling midday meal, rooted in both thrift and tradition. Fresh ears of corn were boiled until tender, then served hot with slices of bread to round out the plate. Sometimes butter or drippings were added for flavor, but even plain, the combination filled stomachs. Housewives valued it because corn was inexpensive, plentiful, and easy to prepare, while bread stretched the meal into something more substantial. Children loved biting into sweet corn, while adults appreciated its practicality and the steady energy it provided. It was a dish that reflected the rural rhythms of eating what was in season, simple and unadorned, but dependable. Though it might seem too plain for modern tables, boiled corn with bread was once a regular lunch, proving that even the simplest foods carried meaning and comfort when shared at the family table. Leftover black-eyed peas and cornbread carried the spirit of hope into every lunchbox. Traditionally eaten on New Year's Day for luck, the leftovers became weekday meals that reminded everyone that better days were coming. The peas, cooked soft with bits of pork, mixed beautifully with crumbled cornbread, soaking up their rich, smoky flavor. Cold or warm, it was the taste of comfort and continuity, proof that nothing went to waste. The dish carried symbolism as deep as its flavor: prosperity, patience, and perseverance. For families who lived by faith in food, black-eyed peas were never just beans. They were wishes you could eat, traditions you could hold. Leftover black-eyed peas and cornbread were the living memory of resilience, a quiet celebration of survival served in every spoonful. The texture of soft peas and grainy bread felt like history retold through taste, one humble meal at a time. Even when times were tight, there was pride in having enough to save for later. This was food that remembered where it came from, food that kept hope alive without needing to say a word. Each bite was a blessing, a reminder that no matter how small the meal, gratitude made it grand. Field pea and rice pilaf turned a handful of pantry staples into a fragrant dish that could stand proudly on its own at the center of a midday table. Field peas were simmered until tender with garlic, bay leaf, and a touch of black pepper, then folded gently into long grain rice cooked in homemade stock. Chopped bell pepper and onion added color and sweetness, while a drizzle of olive oil gave the finished pilaf a light sheen. Families often made a large pot in the morning so it would be ready when children came home for lunch or when neighbors dropped by unannounced. The dish carried the legacy of West African rice traditions and proved that a meal did not need meat to feel hearty and complete. In the 1970s, it appeared at picnics, church gatherings, and everyday kitchens alike, earning its place as a beloved dish that tasted as good cold as it did warm. One pot, simple ingredients, lasting satisfaction. Rice and gravy bowls turned the humble leftovers of a Sunday roast into a Monday lunch that felt just as satisfying. Fluffy white rice provided the canvas, while the drippings from roasted meat were whisked with flour and stock into a silky brown gravy. Any scraps of beef or pork were shredded and stirred in, stretching small amounts of protein to feed a crowd. This thrifty favorite ensured that nothing from a hard-earned meal went to waste and that families could enjoy a hearty dish without spending another cent. Grandparents recall how the aroma of warm gravy over rice brought everyone to the table with eager appetites, even when money was tight. It was a dish of gratitude as much as sustenance, honoring the work that went into every harvest and every piece of meat. Served in deep bowls with a side of pickled vegetables, it proved that leftovers, when treated with care, could rival any fresh-cooked feast in flavor and comfort. Stewed okra and tomatoes was one of the most dependable meals when canned goods and garden produce carried families through tight weeks. Mothers sliced fresh okra or thawed frozen pieces, then stirred them into canned tomatoes with onions, pepper, and whatever seasoning was available. The ingredients simmered until everything softened into a thick, flavorful stew that was bright, tangy, and deeply comforting. Served over rice, the dish became hearty enough to count as a full dinner. Children learned to love the soft texture and bold colors, especially when the stew was paired with hot cornbread. It was a meal that proved vegetables could be just as filling and just as important as meat. Many families grew okra in backyard gardens, which made this dish even more accessible, especially in southern homes where neighbors often traded vegetables across fences. The simmering pot offered not just nourishment, but a sense of continuity, reminding everyone that the land and the community still had something to give. Even when times were hardest, a pot of stewed okra and tomatoes represented stability, a meal that could appear again and again without complaint. Stewed okra and tomatoes kept families fed with nothing but patience and a steady simmering pot. Butter bean chowder brought a slow and gentle warmth to midday meals, offering creamy comfort from the first spoonful. Dried butter beans were soaked overnight, then simmered with onions, celery, and a careful sprinkle of smoked paprika that filled kitchens with a soft, woodsy aroma. A splash of milk or evaporated milk gave the broth its silky texture, while a handful of fresh herbs brightened the flavor without overwhelming the natural sweetness of the beans. In many neighborhoods, this chowder became a staple for workers heading home for a short lunch because it could be reheated without losing its rich taste. Families would cook a large pot early in the day so everyone could ladle out a bowl whenever hunger struck. Served with a slice of hot water cornbread or a simple biscuit, it satisfied without demanding expensive ingredients. The chowder proved that thrift and pleasure could share the same bowl and that a humble bean could anchor a meal worth remembering. Cane syrup over cold biscuits was a lunch that turned leftovers into comfort. Biscuits left from breakfast would be split open and covered with thick cane syrup, soaking into the bread until sweet and sticky. It was quick, inexpensive, and satisfying, requiring nothing more than what was already on hand. Housewives appreciated this because it wasted nothing, stretching food into another meal without extra cost. Children loved it because the syrup turned plain bread into a treat, while adults valued the energy it gave when paired with coffee or milk. Cane syrup was widely available in the South, making it a natural companion to biscuits that might otherwise go stale. The dish was simple, but it represented practicality, turning scraps into nourishment. Though it might seem plain now, cane syrup over cold biscuits was once a beloved quick meal, a reminder that even leftovers could carry sweetness and comfort during hard times. Greens and cornbread crumble was what happened when practicality met perfection. Collard greens simmered low and long with smoked meat until the broth turned dark and rich. Then came the cornbread, crumbled right into the potlikker, soaking up the flavor like a sponge of soul. It was eaten with a spoon, straight from the bowl, warm or cold, it didn't matter. This one-dish meal was the taste of thrift and ingenuity, made from leftovers but worthy of celebration. The texture was a mix of soft and hearty, every bite carrying the essence of smoky greens and golden bread. It filled you up, fed your spirit, and reminded you that abundance could be built from scraps. In homes where nothing was ever wasted, greens and cornbread crumble was both resource and reward. It wasn't just something to eat, it was something to feel, a humble harmony of earth, smoke, and love. Families often gathered around the table with bowls of it, sharing silence and satisfaction after long days of work. Some added hot sauce or onions for a little bite. Others ate it plain, savoring the depth of the potlikker. It tasted like history, like the rhythm of the kitchen passed down through calloused hands and steady hearts. Charcoal grilled pork steak delivered the rich, smoky flavor of outdoor cooking to an everyday lunch. Shoulder cuts of pork, more marbled and affordable than loin, were marinated in vinegar, garlic, and a blend of garden herbs before meeting a bed of glowing hardwood coals. The slow grilling allowed fat to render and smoke to infuse every bite with a deep, rustic aroma. Families often gathered outside around makeshift pits, turning the act of cooking into a midday celebration where neighbors shared stories while the meat sizzled. The result was tender slices with crisp edges and a flavor that could never come from an indoor stove. Grandparents remember these cookouts as community events where everyone brought a side dish, from collard greens to cornbread, creating a table that felt endless. The taste of that smoky pork remains a powerful reminder of summer afternoons, family togetherness, and the simple joy of good food prepared over an open flame. Sweet potato hash was the kind of skillet meal that turned one or two inexpensive sweet potatoes into enough food to fill every stomach at the table. Mothers peeled the potatoes, sliced them thin, and mixed them with onions that softened slowly in a hot pan. As everything fried together, the sweet potatoes caramelized around the edges, their natural sugars creating a deep, warm flavor that tasted richer than anything bought in a store. Hog kidney stew was a dish that made use of organ meat, transforming what some discarded into a sustaining lunch. Kidneys were cleaned, chopped, and simmered with onions and potatoes until tender, creating a savory stew rich in flavor. It was often eaten with cornbread, which helped stretch the meal further and soak up the broth. Housewives valued the recipe because hog kidneys were inexpensive and often overlooked, yet with careful cooking they became nourishing. Children often hesitated at the idea of eating kidneys, but adults appreciated the practicality of using every part of the animal. The dish reflected the cultural emphasis on thrift, making nothing go to waste. Hog kidney stew was not glamorous, but it represented resilience and the determination to make meals from whatever was available. Though rarely eaten now, it once stood proudly in kitchens as a symbol of resourcefulness and tradition, feeding families during times when frugality mattered most. Cold butter beans and ham were the quiet leftovers that never disappointed. After simmering for hours the night before, they were cooled and packed for the next day's lunch. The beans were tender and creamy, soaking in the savory flavor of ham hocks. Served cold or room temperature, they still carried that smoky depth that filled stomachs and soothed hearts. It was food that traveled easily, eaten from jars or tin bowls on lunch breaks or porches. A sprinkle of salt, a splash of vinegar, and you had a meal as good as fresh. It was practical, flavorful, and made to last, exactly what a hardworking person needed. Cold butter beans and ham were the sound of thrift meeting satisfaction, the quiet victory of knowing tomorrow's meal was already made. Mustard greens and cornmeal dumplings were a lunch that blended greens with filling starch to create a complete meal. Fresh mustard greens were simmered slowly until tender, flavored with bits of pork or drippings, and dumplings made from cornmeal were dropped into the pot to cook. The result was savory, earthy, and comforting, a dish that filled bellies without needing expensive ingredients. Housewives liked it because both mustard greens and cornmeal were inexpensive, abundant, and dependable, stretching far to feed large families. Children sometimes resisted the bitterness of greens, but the dumplings softened the flavor, making it more appealing. Adults appreciated the warmth and nourishment, especially on long workdays. Mustard greens and cornmeal dumplings reflected the tradition of combining vegetables and grains into meals that felt complete, sustaining families with thrift and ingenuity. Though rarely cooked today, they once carried both heritage and necessity, standing as a symbol of resourceful African-American kitchens. Smoked sausage and cabbage skillet brought big flavor out of humble ingredients, creating a lunch that filled the kitchen with the aroma of hickory and spice. Thick slices of smoked pork sausage sizzled in a heavy skillet before ribbons of cabbage were added to the pan, soaking up every drop of savory fat. A handful of onions and a splash of cider vinegar brightened the dish and balanced the richness of the meat. Served over buttered rice or eaten straight from the skillet with crusty bread, it was a quick meal that required little more than a knife and a cutting board. In the 1970s, it became a favorite for workers coming home on a short break or for families needing a warm meal before heading back to afternoon chores. The combination of smoky meat and tender cabbage created a flavor that felt bigger than its parts and reminded everyone how satisfying a one-pan lunch could be when cooked with care and a little imagination. Collard green hand pies were a traveling worker's best friend, easy to pack and even easier to eat on the move. Tender collard greens simmered with smoked meat scraps were chopped and seasoned with onions, garlic, and a splash of vinegar before being tucked inside pockets of flaky pastry dough. Once sealed, the pies were baked until golden, locking in steam that kept the filling moist and flavorful. These portable lunches were perfect for field hands, factory employees, and school children alike, offering a warm taste of home in every bite. Families often prepared them the night before so that a quick reheat or even a cold serving would satisfy hunger during long days away from the kitchen. The aroma of collards mixed with smoky pork carried a comfort that no store-bought snack could match. Each hand pie told a story of resourcefulness and pride in southern gardens, where greens grew abundantly and nothing went to waste. Today, they remain a cherished but rarely seen link to a simpler, heartier way of eating. Hog maw and potatoes was a dish rooted in tradition and necessity, using pork stomachs simmered long enough to become tender and flavorful. Mothers cleaned the hog maw carefully, then stewed it with onions, salt, pepper, and chunks of potatoes. The long cooking process softened everything into a heavy, sustaining pot that filled the kitchen with warmth. Children often approached the dish with caution at first, but the rich flavor and tender potatoes won them over. It was the kind of meal that carried families through cold nights and hard days. Many households learned the dish from older relatives who had relied on it long before the 1960s, passing down not just a recipe but a method of survival. The smell of the stew simmering created a sense of reassurance, a reminder that something warm and filling was waiting at the table. Hog maw and potatoes was history, hardship, and nourishment in one pot. Okra and corn succotash was one of those dishes that carried the memory of gardens into midday meals. Fresh or preserved okra was chopped into coins and sautéed with corn kernels, often flavored with a little fatback or bacon grease for richness. The result was a skillet lunch that was bright, tender, and full of flavor, served either alone or with bread to make it more filling. For families living off small gardens or victory plots, okra and corn were easy crops that stretched well through the season. Succotash was hearty enough to keep adults working through the afternoon, but also mild enough for children to enjoy. It was a way of celebrating what was grown at home while saving money at the same time. Though succotash is rarely thought of today, it once stood proudly as a thrifty and nourishing lunch plate in African American kitchens, tying community, land, and resourcefulness together. Salmon croquettes and rice were a weekday staple that stretched one can into a feast. The salmon was mixed with onions, eggs, and cornmeal, shaped into patties, and fried until golden and crisp at the edges. The outside crunched, the inside stayed soft, rich, and savory. Served over a scoop of hot rice and drizzled with hot sauce, it became a dish that felt special, no matter how often it appeared. It was a cook's answer to tight budgets and big appetites. The scent filled kitchens with comfort, the sizzling sound in the pan like a promise of something good coming soon. Grandmothers made them on Fridays, mothers packed them in lunch boxes, and everyone knew they were good cold too. It was food with rhythm, steady, reliable, and full of flavor. Salmon croquettes and rice were more than just a meal. They were proof that care, creativity, and a can of fish could make magic on any table. Slipped easily from the bone, then coated in a smoky, sweet barbecue sauce rich with molasses and vinegar. The meat was piled high on soft French bread that soaked up every drop of sauce, while a handful of crisp lettuce and sliced tomato added freshness. Vendors sold these sandwiches from street corners in New Orleans and from family-run cafes in cities across the South, and their popularity spread quickly through the 1970s. Each bite offered a perfect mix of tender meat, warm bread, and sauce that dripped down to your fingertips. Eating one demanded napkins and patience, but no one minded because the taste was worth every mess. They were affordable, filling, and unmistakably tied to the African American lunch counters that defined the flavor of the decade. Okra gumbo with turkey andouille proved that deep flavor did not require heavy cuts of pork or seafood to shine. A dark roux began the process, stirred patiently until it reached a rich chocolate hue that promised depth and warmth. Sliced turkey sausage added a gentle smokiness, while fresh okra thickened the stew and gave it a silken texture that clung to every grain of rice. Onions, bell peppers, and celery formed the holy trinity of Creole cooking, releasing their fragrance as the pot simmered slowly over a low flame. This lighter lunch allowed families to stretch limited ingredients while still enjoying the unmistakable taste of Louisiana gumbo. Grandparents remembered gathering around bowls of this hearty dish during cool afternoons, the steam rising as conversation filled the kitchen. Served with a hunk of cornbread or ladled over plain rice, it nourished body and spirit alike. The memory of that deep brown roux and gentle spice remains a treasured flavor of coastal African American heritage even when it no longer appears on everyday menus. Catfish head stew was a resourceful dish created when whole fillets were too expensive to buy. Fish heads, cheap but packed with flavor, were simmered with onions, celery, peppers, and seasonings until they infused the broth with richness. Mothers removed the bones carefully, leaving behind tender pieces of meat that melted into the stew. Potatoes or rice were added to stretch the meal further. The smell of the stew simmering filled the home, comforting and familiar. Children ate it eagerly, savoring each warm spoonful. Many families along southern rivers or coastal areas relied on this dish because fish heads were easy to come by, often sold for pennies or given away. The broth became milky and rich, carrying a depth that no one would expect from such humble beginnings. Catfish head stew was proof that even the parts overlooked by others could feed a family well. Cold fried chicken wrapped in wax paper was more than a meal. It was memory made portable. Every piece was fried golden in cast iron, seasoned by hand, and cooled just enough to keep its crisp shell. Once wrapped in wax paper, it stayed perfect for hours, whether it was packed in a lunch pail for a long work shift or taken to church picnics under a shade tree. The sound of that paper crinkling was enough to make anyone hungry. Even cold, it carried that same smoky, salty perfume, proof that good food did not need to be hot to be comforting. Fried chicken like this was cooked with love, stretched to feed many, and built to last the day. It reminded families of hands that worked hard but never forgot how to make joy out of something simple. In every bite was patience, pride, and purpose. Cold fried chicken wrapped in wax paper was a lesson in care, a reminder that even when life was hard, flavor and family never lost their place. Corn pone and buttermilk plates were a steady lunch that spoke of tradition and simplicity. Corn pone was a dense, unleavened cornbread made from cornmeal and water, baked or fried until firm. It could be served warm or cold, often sliced into wedges or squares. Paired with a bowl or glass of tangy buttermilk, it became a complete meal that filled stomachs without needing expensive meat. The combination was a fixture in African American households, particularly in rural areas where cornmeal and dairy were cheap and accessible. Children often dipped their corn pone directly into the buttermilk, softening it into something almost like porridge, while adults valued it for its straightforward nourishment. It was quick, inexpensive, and familiar, the kind of food that connected families to earlier generations. Though rarely remembered today, corn pone and buttermilk once carried dignity in their simplicity, proving that even the humblest ingredients could make a lasting lunch tradition. Okra rice fritters turned leftover grains into a crisp and savory snack that doubled as a full lunch when paired with a simple salad. Cooked rice was mixed with chopped fresh okra, diced onions, and a pinch of cayenne before being shaped into small patties. The mixture sizzled in hot oil until each fritter formed a golden crust, while the inside stayed soft and slightly sticky. The okra's natural thickening power bound the ingredients together without needing extra eggs or flour. These fritters were a clever way to use what was already in the pantry, making them perfect for busy families and thrifty cooks alike. Served hot with a spoonful of pepper vinegar or a dab of mustard, they carried a satisfying bite that made even a small plate feel abundant. In the 1970s, they were common in kitchens where nothing was wasted, and every meal was a chance to turn simplicity into flavor. Each fritter proved that leftovers could shine brighter than the first meal. Barbecue turkey. Neck po' boys were the sort of sandwich that could turn a quiet afternoon into a neighborhood event. Turkey necks were slow-cooked over low heat until the meat. Turnip green and potato hash turned two simple ingredients into a feast that could carry workers through the longest afternoons. Tender turnip greens, chopped and lightly salted, were cooked down with diced potatoes in a skillet slicked with pork drippings or bacon fat. Onions added sweetness, while a dash of vinegar at the end brightened every bite. This meal made excellent use of garden vegetables that were cheap, plentiful, and easy to grow even in poor soil. Grandparents remembered gathering fresh greens early in the morning and frying them up before heading to the fields or the factory floor. The combination of hearty potatoes and nutrient-rich greens gave lasting energy and filled every plate without straining the family budget. Served with a side of cornbread or a slice of leftover ham if it was available, this humble hash proved that good cooking is not about expensive ingredients but about care, timing, and an understanding of how to make the most of what you have. Neckbone stew was one of the most reliable survival meals African American families made in the 1960s because neck bones were cheap, overlooked, and full of hidden flavor that only revealed itself after hours of slow simmering. Mothers would rinse the bones carefully, removing bits that needed to go, then drop them into a large pot with onions, carrots, celery, and whatever seasoning the kitchen had that week. As the pot warmed, the broth slowly turned cloudy and rich, carrying the smell of something far more expensive than what had actually gone into the pot. Potatoes were added to stretch the stew even further, each one soaking up the savory juices until they were soft and comforting. Children would hover near the stove, watching the steam rise in thick waves that fogged the windows and made the kitchen feel like the warmest place in the house. When it was finally ready, everyone sat down with bowls that filled their hands with heat. The bones themselves offered only small pieces of meat, but the long simmering made every drop count. The broth was thick, nourishing, and deeply satisfying, the kind of food that wrapped itself around tired bodies after long days. Neck bone stew was not just dinner. It was survival made gentle. It was proof that even scraps could carry a family through cold nights when money ran thin. Neckbone sandwiches were the kind of meal that turned scraps into gold. The meat, pulled from pork necks, simmered for hours with onions and a pinch of salt, came out tender enough to fall apart. It was layered between slices of white bread, brushed with mustard, and eaten slow to catch every drop of juice. It was the kind of lunch you worked for and savored twice. In kitchens that stretched every dollar, neck bones were more than food. They were a ritual of survival and pride. Grandparents remembered the smell of it filling small houses, mingling with laughter and talk. The sandwich was humble, but it fed the soul as much as the body. It spoke of people who knew how to make plenty from little, turning patience into richness. Neckbone sandwiches were history between two slices of bread, soft, strong, and unforgettable. Stewed pigeon peas with rice was one of those quiet staples that held its place on lunch tables in African American kitchens, especially in communities touched by Southern and Caribbean influences. Pigeon peas, small and earthy, were simmered slowly with onion, peppers, and broth until tender, then poured over rice for a filling plate that stretched far with little cost. Fatback or ham hock was sometimes added for flavor, but many families kept it meatless when money was tight. The dish carried with it the reminder of resourcefulness, because peas and rice were inexpensive, nourishing, and easy to grow or store. Children often grew up on bowls of this, eating it at midday before chores or school, while adults leaned on it as dependable sustenance during work. It was hearty without being heavy, flavorful without requiring expensive spices, and versatile enough to be reheated later. Today, stewed pigeon peas with rice is rarely thought of as lunch, but it once carried the weight of survival and comfort at the same time. Collard green and smoked turkey sandwiches were the kind of meal that could keep you full through an afternoon shift and still taste like something made with care at home. Tender greens, slow-cooked with onion, and a touch of vinegar gave each bite a soft tang that balanced the rich smokiness of turkey left to simmer for hours. The sandwich bread was always fresh from a local bakery or a neighbor's oven, and many families would wrap these in wax paper for easy carrying to school or work. In the 1970s, these sandwiches traveled to church picnics, jazz festivals, and union lunch breaks, bringing the same comfort wherever they went. They were not just leftovers pressed together, but a reflection of community cooking where every ingredient stretched to feed more than one plate. People often added a swipe of mustard or homemade hot sauce for an extra kick, though the core of the sandwich needed nothing but the steady flavor of greens and turkey to feel complete. Collard green and smoked turkey sandwiches were the kind of meal that could keep you full through an afternoon shift and still taste like something made with care at home. Tender greens, slow-cooked with onion, and a touch of vinegar gave each bite a soft tang that balanced the rich smokiness of turkey left to simmer for hours. The sandwich bread was always fresh from a local bakery or a neighbor's oven, and many families would wrap these in wax paper for easy carrying to school or work. In the 1970s, these sandwiches traveled to church picnics, jazz festivals, and union lunch breaks, bringing the same comfort wherever they went. They were not just leftovers pressed together, but a reflection of community cooking where every ingredient stretched to feed more than one plate. People often added a swipe of mustard or homemade hot sauce for an extra kick, though the core of the sandwich needed nothing but the steady flavor of greens and turkey to feel complete. Fried salt pork with biscuits was a meal built on stretching a little into a lot. Salt pork, inexpensive and heavily seasoned, was sliced thin and fried in a skillet until crisp around the edges. The rendered fat crackled in the pan, filling the kitchen with a smell that pulled every child to the table. Mothers used the leftover grease to brush over fresh biscuits or to season them as they baked. Even one piece of salt pork could flavor an entire plate, making the biscuits taste richer and heartier than they were. Children cherished every bite, feeling like they were eating something special, even though the meal was born from thrift. The sound of the pork frying, loud and sharp, often woke children from naps or made them stop playing just to ask if dinner was almost ready. A small amount of meat flavored an entire meal, and for many families, that was the only way to make ingredients last through the week. The biscuits soaked up every drop of flavor, turning something simple into something that felt indulgent. Fried salt pork with biscuits turned scarcity into something warm and memorable. Fish fry leftovers were Friday night turned into Monday's comfort. Cold whiting or catfish, fried crisp in cornmeal and left to rest overnight, made the best sandwiches come morning. Layered between soft white bread with a drizzle of hot sauce, they carried all the flavor of the weekend into the work week. Families who gathered for fish fries on porches and backyards kept the leftovers for lunch, wrapping them in paper and storing them in ice boxes. The crunch softened, the spice deepened, and the fish took on that perfect next-day flavor, cool, peppery, and familiar. It was food that carried laughter, gospel music, and stories from one day into the next. For those who worked long hours, those sandwiches were reminders of joy waiting back home. Fish fry leftovers were more than just lunch. They were yesterday's celebration turned into today's strength. They reminded everyone that food was meant to bring people together, even after the crowd had gone. The bones of the meal held memories: neighbors talking, oil popping, children laughing over lemonade. Cold fish and soft bread became the taste of belonging, a comfort that lingered long after the last bite. Cabbage and potato cakes were a thrifty lunch born out of leftovers that would have otherwise gone to waste. Mashed potatoes were mixed with boiled or stewed cabbage, then shaped into patties and fried until golden on both sides. The cakes were served hot, often with a slice of bread or cornbread on the side to make the meal more filling. Housewives liked them because they transformed scraps into something satisfying, stretching meals when meat was scarce or too expensive. Children enjoyed the crisp outside and soft inside, making them easier to eat than plain cabbage. Adults leaned on them as a quick solution that required no new ingredients and could be cooked in minutes. The cakes symbolized a kind of frugality that did not feel like sacrifice, since they carried flavor, texture, and comfort. Today they have mostly disappeared, but at one time cabbage and potato cakes represented both resilience and everyday ingenuity. Barbecue. Rib-tip sandwiches turned an inexpensive cut of meat into a smoky masterpiece that defined roadside dining during the decade. Rib tips were seasoned with a dry rub of paprika, garlic, and black pepper before being slow cooked over smoldering hickory until the meat turned tender and the edges caramelized. The juicy pieces were chopped and piled onto thick slices of soft white bread or sturdy rolls that soaked up the sweet and tangy sauce. These sandwiches were sold from small stands along highways where travelers followed the scent of wood smoke long before they saw the hand-painted signs. In the 1970s, they became a lunchtime staple for workers and families who wanted a feast without paying a feast price. Every bite delivered a perfect balance of rich pork and sticky sauce, leaving fingers coated in a glaze that begged to be licked clean. It was proof that great barbecue flavor did not require fancy cuts, only time, care, and a good fire to bring the taste alive. Stewed chicken with dumplings was a midday feast that filled stomachs and hearts with equal measure. Chicken pieces were browned in a heavy pot, then simmered with onions, carrots, and celery until the broth turned rich and deeply aromatic. Soft dough was dropped into the bubbling liquid, forming fluffy dumplings that soaked up every drop of flavor. This meal turned a single bird into enough servings for a large family, a lesson in stretching resources without sacrificing taste. Grandparents recall how the kitchen filled with steam and savory scents while the dumplings puffed and floated like little clouds of comfort. A ladle of this stew over a bowl brought warmth that lasted through a long afternoon of labor or school. It was often served during community gatherings where neighbors shared not just food, but stories and laughter, reinforcing the sense of togetherness that defined the era. Even now, the thought of tender chicken and pillowy dumplings carries the unmistakable comfort of home and tradition. Chicken necks and dumplings were a version of chicken and dumplings that made the most out of the least. Necks were one of the cheapest poultry parts, offering flavor even if they held only scraps of meat. Mothers boiled them with onions, celery, and seasoning until the broth turned rich and deeply comforting. Dumplings made from flour, water, and a little fat were dropped into the pot, swelling as they soaked up the broth. The dumplings provided most of the substance, while the necks gave the stew its flavor. Children loved the soft, doughy dumplings and the warmth the dish brought to cold evenings. Some families stretched the pot by adding potatoes or carrots, while others kept it simple, letting the broth and dumplings carry the meal on their own. The long, simmering time filled the home with the kind of aroma that drew children to the kitchen just to peek inside the pot. For mothers, it was a reliable way to feed many mouths without worrying about running out. Chicken necks and dumplings were proof that comfort did not require abundance. Hot water cornbread was a quick skillet bread that turned basic pantry ingredients into something warm and filling. Mothers mixed cornmeal with boiling water and salt, shaping the mixture into patties that sizzled when they hit the hot oil. The edges crisped beautifully while the inside stayed soft and tender. Children waited eagerly for their turn, enjoying the cornbread with beans, greens, or even on its own. The sound of the batter hitting the skillet was enough to signal that dinner was almost ready. Sometimes the patties were shaped thick, other times thin and crispy, depending on how far the batter needed to stretch. Even without butter or extras, each bite tasted rich because of the hot oil and the golden crust it created. It was cheap, fast, and comforting, the kind of recipe every child learned by watching it come together. Hot water cornbread added body to meals that might otherwise feel too thin, turning simple dinners into satisfying ones. Sweet potato and black-eyed pea patties brought together two beloved Southern staples in a single hearty dish. Mashed sweet potatoes provided a naturally sweet base, while cooked black-eyed peas added protein and texture. Mixed with onions, garlic, and a sprinkle of cornmeal, the mixture was formed into thick cakes and pan seared in a cast-iron skillet until a crisp crust developed. The inside stayed moist and flavorful, offering a satisfying bite with every forkful. These patties were an ideal lunch for families looking to stretch ingredients while still creating something memorable. Grandparents recall how the smell of sizzling sweet potato filled the kitchen and how these patties were often served with a simple salad of garden greens or a dollop of tangy relish. They were not just economical but celebratory, proving that a meatless meal could be just as filling and festive as any meat-based dish. Today, their legacy lives on as a testament to the creativity and resilience of African-American cooks in the early 20th century. Fried okra po' boys transformed a simple vegetable into the star of a sandwich that rivaled any seafood creation. Fresh okra slices were dusted in seasoned cornmeal and fried until crisp, then heaped onto a soft baguette, still warm from the oven. A generous smear of spicy remoulade added a creamy heat that played perfectly with the crunchy okra. Lettuce and tomato provided cool contrast, while the bread absorbed just enough oil to keep every bite indulgent. In the 1970s, these po' boys became a popular alternative to traditional fried shrimp or oyster versions, especially in neighborhoods where okra grew plentifully in backyard gardens. Street vendors wrapped them in parchment for easy eating on the go, and families recreated them at home for casual lunches or late-night snacks. The sandwich captured the ingenuity of cooks who could elevate a humble crop into something unforgettable. It remains a mouth-watering memory for anyone who tasted the way crisp okra and bold sauce came together between two slices of soft bread. Peanut stew with sweet potatoes was a Southern adaptation of African recipes that carried both thrift and flavor. Peanuts were ground into a paste or simmered with broth, then combined with chunks of sweet potato to create a thick, hearty stew. The dish was rich, slightly sweet, and deeply satisfying, making it a popular choice when meat was scarce. Housewives liked it because peanuts were cheap and abundant, while sweet potatoes grew easily in southern soil, ensuring both ingredients were accessible to nearly everyone. Children enjoyed the creamy texture and natural sweetness, while adults valued the nourishing balance of protein and starch. It reflected African roots adapted to American kitchens, showing how cultural memory survived in food. Peanut stew with sweet potatoes was more than a meal. It was a link between past and present, carried in every bowl. Though it has faded from everyday lunches, It once represented resilience, thrift, and heritage on Southern tables. Fried green tomato sandwiches were the color of summer held between bread. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in cornmeal, fried until crisp and golden, then layered onto soft white bread with mayonnaise or hot sauce. The contrast was everything: the crunch of the crust, the tart burst of tomato, the cool creaminess of the spread. It was a dish made when gardens were full and money was short, a way to turn abundance into comfort. Families cooked them in cast-iron skillets, the oil popping like applause as each slice browned. Served warm or cold, they were light but full of heart, a true Southern balance of tang and texture. Fried green tomato sandwiches were living proof that the simplest food could still taste like a feast when seasoned with care. They tasted of homegrown pride, of hands that planted, picked, and cooked from the same soil. You could hear the sizzle and smell the promise before the first bite even touched your tongue. They brought people together in kitchens and porches, laughter echoing over the sound of frying oil. Fried green tomato sandwiches were sunshine you could hold, bright, familiar, and made with love that lingered long after the meal was gone. Pumpkin and corn stew was a lunch that carried both thrift and comfort, filling bowls with the flavors of the field. Cubes of pumpkin were simmered slowly with kernels of corn, onions, and simple seasonings until tender. The sweetness of the pumpkin blended with the corn to create a dish that was hearty but never heavy, a perfect partner to warm slices of cornbread served on the side. Housewives liked it because pumpkin was easy to grow and store, while corn was plentiful in most communities, making the combination both accessible and affordable. Children often enjoyed the mild sweetness, while adults appreciated how filling it was after long hours of work. The stew reflected both practicality and heritage, drawing on African and native food traditions that celebrated vegetables at the heart of the meal. Pumpkin and corn stew rarely appears on modern tables, but at one time it was a symbol of how communities turned simple crops into sustenance, carrying both nourishment and cultural memory in every bite. Pan-fried rabbit chops reflected a time when families relied on what they could hunt or raise themselves. Lean rabbit meat, lightly breaded in seasoned flour, cooked quickly in a skillet of hot lard, creating a crisp crust that sealed in the delicate flavor. This was a practical lunch for rural households where rabbits were plentiful and store-bought meat too costly. Children learned early how to clean and prepare the meat, turning the preparation into a family task that connected generations. Served with wild greens or a spoon of stewed apples, the dish provided lean protein and a taste of the land itself. Grandparents often recall the smell of frying rabbit drifting across farmyards, a scent that meant the hunt had been successful and everyone would eat well. Though modern diners rarely encounter rabbit, those who remember say no store-bought chicken can match the tender bite of a perfectly cooked chop. It remains a proud reminder of resourcefulness and respect for the animals that fed a community. Stewed chicken gizzards were a meal that took time and patience, but mothers knew the effort would turn the toughest cuts into something tender and deeply flavorful. Gizzards were cleaned carefully, then simmered with onions, celery, and spices until they softened into a rich stew. The broth thickened as it cooked, becoming hearty enough to pour over rice, potatoes, or bread. Children who hesitated at first bite soon learned that the long cooking made the gizzards soft, savory, and comforting. The dish filled the house with a warm aroma that signaled dinner time long before the bowls were served. Because gizzards were inexpensive, mothers could cook a large pot without worrying about running short. Leftovers tasted even better the next day, making the dish a reliable option during tight weeks. Stewed chicken gizzards were resilience in a pot, turning an overlooked cut into a meal full of strength. Pokeweed greens with cornbread were a survival lunch that carried caution as well as nourishment. Young pokeweed shoots, carefully harvested before they grew toxic, were boiled repeatedly to remove bitterness and danger. Once tender, they were seasoned lightly and served alongside cornbread for a meal that was simple yet filling. Foraging pokeweed required knowledge passed through families, since picking it at the wrong stage could be harmful. Housewives valued it because it was free food gathered from the land, while cornbread turned it into a complete meal. Children rarely enjoyed the bitter taste, but adults accepted it as a dependable option when money or supplies were scarce. It was a dish that spoke to resilience and the close relationship between people and the land. Today, pokeweed greens are largely forgotten, but once they were an important reminder that survival often meant making the most of what nature provided, even when risky. Fatback and biscuit lunches were the taste of endurance, salty and rich and made to last. Strips of cured pork fat were fried crisp, tucked into warm biscuits fresh from the oven. The combination was pure satisfaction, a crunch of salt followed by the soft, buttery crumble of bread. It was food for field hands, factory workers, and anyone who needed fuel that stayed with them. Wrapped in wax paper, it fit neatly into pockets or pails, ready for long days and short breaks. It was greasy, humble, and made with pride. Fatback and biscuit lunches reminded every worker that they were valued, that home was never far even when miles away. It was the taste of effort rewarded, a meal that proved strength came not just from hard work, but from knowing how to feed it. Sometimes molasses or mustard was added for a touch of sweetness or spice, and each bite told a story of resourcefulness. These biscuits carried love as surely as they carried flavor, baked early in the morning by hands that knew routine and care. Fatback and biscuit lunches were the original power meal, built from grit, faith, and the timeless hunger for something that truly satisfies. Fried green tomato BLTs took a familiar diner sandwich and gave it a bright southern character that no one forgot once they tasted it. Thick slices of firm green tomatoes were dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried until the coating was crunchy and golden, while the inside stayed slightly tart. They replaced or joined the usual ripe tomato slices between layers of crisp lettuce and smoky bacon, turning a standard lunch into something with a spark of creativity. Mayonnaise or a homemade remoulade added a cool creaminess that balanced the heat of the skillet fried tomatoes. These sandwiches were common in community cafes and roadside diners that dotted the South during the 1970s, where cooks knew how to stretch ingredients while keeping flavor bold. Packed into lunchboxes or wrapped in wax paper for road trips, they carried the scent of sizzling cornmeal long after they were made. Each bite captured a mix of crunch, smoke, and tang that called people back for another sandwich even when they thought one would be enough. Fried chitterlings bites offered a bold flavor and a crispy texture that rewarded those willing to put in the work of cleaning and preparing them. Chitterlings, or pig intestines, were meticulously washed, boiled until tender, and then cut into bite-sized pieces. These pieces were seasoned with salt, pepper, and a hint of cayenne before being dredged in cornmeal and dropped into hot oil. The result was a snack or lunch with a golden crunch and a rich, savory interior. Families valued this dish because it used every part of the animal, honoring a tradition of waste-nothing cooking. Grandparents remember entire mornings spent cleaning chitterlings while stories and laughter filled the kitchen, making the process a communal event. Served with hot sauce or a splash of vinegar, these bites were both a treat and a testament to resilience. The strong, distinctive aroma might surprise modern diners, but for those who grew up with it, fried chitterlings are a beloved reminder of resourceful cooking and shared family heritage. Cornbread and buttermilk in a bowl was one of the purest meals ever made. A leftover square of cornbread was crumbled into a bowl and covered with cold buttermilk until it soaked through. Eaten with a spoon, it was both breakfast and lunch for many, a cool meal on a hot afternoon or a quick one before a long day's work. It was simple food, but it filled you up and refreshed your spirit. The tang of buttermilk mixed with the sweetness of cornmeal, creating a balance that never needed fixing. Elders swore it kept them strong, a kind of rural nourishment that required no stove, no fuss, just honesty. Cornbread and buttermilk in a bowl was humility made beautiful, a reminder that the best meals often came from what was already there. The sound of the cornbread crumbling and the first splash of buttermilk was comfort itself. It was a farmer's lunch, a grandmother's wisdom, a child's first taste of simplicity done right. Some added a sprinkle of sugar or black pepper for extra bite, but it never needed help to shine. Cornbread and buttermilk in a bowl was proof that real satisfaction came from patience, thrift, and the flavor of home. Fried tripe sandwiches were once a common lunch that stretched butcher scraps into something filling and portable. Tripe, the lining of a cow's stomach, was cleaned, boiled until tender, then breaded and fried crisp. The fried pieces were slipped between slices of white bread and often dressed with mustard, hot sauce, or pickles for a sharp bite. For many families, tripe was inexpensive compared to other meats, making it an affordable protein that could be fed to children or carried in lunch pails to work. Though the texture was chewy and the flavor strong, frying gave it a golden crust that made it more appealing. Adults appreciated the thriftiness and the seasoning that could transform tripe into a savory meal, while children often tolerated it when hungry. These sandwiches were tied to a time when nothing from the butcher was wasted. They have nearly vanished today, but once they represented both survival and ingenuity. Honey butter sweet corn on the cob was the highlight of countless summer festivals and neighborhood block parties, celebrated for its sticky sweetness and smoky finish. Fresh ears of corn were brushed with melted butter mixed with honey and a pinch of salt, then wrapped tightly in foil and set over open grills until the kernels grew tender and lightly charred. When unwrapped, the steam carried a fragrance that blended roasted corn and warm honey into an aroma impossible to resist. Children and adults alike lined up for these simple treats, which required nothing more than a napkin and an eager appetite. In the 1970s, farmers' markets and county fairs featured entire stalls dedicated to this dish, and families recreated it at home for backyard lunches and late-night snacks. The combination of natural corn sweetness and rich honey butter needed no extra seasoning, proving that the best festival food often relied on pure, fresh ingredients and a little patience over the fire. One bite, and the world slowed into pure summer delight. Cane syrup glazed ham steak brought a touch of sweetness to the smoky richness of cured pork. A thick slice of ham was seared in a heavy skillet until the edges caramelized, then brushed with dark cane syrup that bubbled into a sticky glaze. The syrup's deep flavor balanced the salt of the ham, creating a harmony that felt festive even on an ordinary afternoon. Families turned to this dish when they needed something quick but special, especially for Sunday lunches after church. Grandparents recall how the scent of sizzling ham filled the house and how a drizzle of extra syrup on top made the meal feel like a treat. Served with biscuits or a side of greens, the ham steak satisfied hunger while using only a small amount of meat, which mattered in lean times. This simple yet luxurious lunch proved that a few well-chosen ingredients and careful cooking could transform a modest cut into something worth remembering and passing down. Sorghum syrup oatmeal was survival disguised as comfort, a reminder that sweetness could still be found even when money was tight. Canned salmon and rice was one of the most dependable meals because a single can could stretch far enough to feed several hungry children. Mothers mixed the salmon with onions, seasonings, and sometimes a little flour to thicken the mixture, then spooned it over a hot pot of rice. The flavors melded together into something savory, warm, and surprisingly satisfying. Even though the salmon came from a can, the dish felt complete, hearty, and nourishing. Children loved the tender texture and the way the rice absorbed the juices of the fish. For many families, this was the dinner that showed up again and again during lean weeks, offering protein without straining the budget. With a side of cornbread or vegetables, it became a full plate that carried families through long evenings. Canned salmon and rice was proof that simple ingredients, handled with care, could create something memorable. Fried bologna sandwiches were the working person's delicacy, simple but unforgettable. Slices of bologna hit a hot skillet, curling at the edges until browned and blistered. A little mayonnaise, a few onions, maybe some mustard, and lunch was done. The smell alone was enough to make mouths water, that smoky scent drifting from kitchen to porch. It was the kind of food that fed both children before school and adults before long shifts. Fried bologna sandwiches did not pretend to be fancy. They were honest, salty, and satisfying. Every family had its own way to make them special: extra crispy, doubled up, or served with chips on the side. For many, this was the taste of home and hard work, wrapped in love and grease-stained paper. Some families fried theirs in bacon grease for extra flavor, while others slapped on a fried egg to make it stretch further. You could hear the sizzle and pop as the bologna tightened in the pan, that quick kitchen rhythm every cook knew by heart. They were fast, filling, and faithful, a sandwich that never disappointed, no matter how many times it was made. Fried bologna sandwiches were a reminder that greatness often hides in simplicity, seasoned by memory and the hum of daily life. Hog jowl and greens plates were a noontime meal that carried both tradition and thrift. Smoked hog jowl, cut from the pig's cheek, was boiled or fried until tender, then served alongside or cooked into a pot of collard or mustard greens. The result was smoky, savory, and nourishing, filling plates without costing much money. For families working long hours in fields or factories, this meal provided strength and satisfaction. Children grew up associating its flavors with home, while adults saw it as a reminder of heritage and necessity. The dish reflected a time when every part of the hog was valued, not just the more expensive cuts. It tied together meat and vegetables in a way that was practical yet deeply flavorful. Today, hog jowl and greens are seldom served as lunch, but once they were a cornerstone of African-American midday meals, embodying resilience, thrift, and cultural pride. Carrot raisin slaw with pineapple added a bright splash of color to cafeteria trays and backyard tables while delivering a cool sweetness that cut through heavier dishes. Shredded carrots were tossed with plump raisins, crushed pineapple, and a dressing made of mayonnaise, lemon juice, and a hint of sugar for balance. The result was a crisp, juicy salad that stayed fresh for hours, making it ideal for long school days or outdoor gatherings. Children loved the natural sweetness, while adults enjoyed the subtle tang that made the slaw more interesting than a plain cabbage version. In the 1970s, it became a standard side at potlucks, especially when the summer heat called for something refreshing and easy to prepare. Many families mixed the ingredients in the morning and left the bowl chilling until lunchtime, knowing the flavors would only improve with time. This simple dish brought a welcome burst of color and a reminder that even everyday vegetables could feel festive when handled with care and creativity. This humble meal carried the history of West African foodways and Southern resilience, proving that a dish born of necessity could be every bit as delicious as a costly feast. Each spoonful told a story of perseverance and community strength that still resonates for those who cherish these old kitchen traditions. Pickled pig feet with crackers offered a bold, tangy bite that was. Pig feet were scrubbed, simmered until tender, then soaked in a brine of vinegar, garlic, and spices until the meat absorbed a bright, mouth-watering flavor. Served cold, often straight from a large jar, they paired perfectly with crisp soda crackers and a glass of sweet tea. This dish was a common sight in neighborhood markets and corner stores where big jars of glistening pig feet invited passers-by to taste a bit of something special for just a few coins. Families appreciated how the vinegar preserved the meat, making it an easy meal to keep on hand during hot southern summers before widespread refrigeration. The chewy, savory texture and sharp bite of the brine became a taste of childhood for many elders who still speak of it with a mix of pride and nostalgia. Though rarely seen on modern lunch tables, the memory of that distinctive flavor remains vivid. Red beans and rice was one of the most iconic survival meals of the 1960s, a dish built on dried beans, rice, and whatever scraps of sausage or bone could be found. Mothers soaked the beans overnight, then cooked them slowly with onions, peppers, and seasoning. A single bone or piece of sausage flavored the entire pot, giving the beans depth and warmth. Served over rice, the dish stretched across several days and only deepened in taste each time it was reheated. Children loved its creaminess, the way the beans melted slightly into the rice, turning into something hearty and satisfying. Some families added a splash of hot sauce, while others served it with cornbread to make the meal go even further. The pot simmered for hours, warming the kitchen and inviting everyone to gather. Close leftovers tasted even better because the flavors had time to blend, turning yesterday's meal into today's comfort. It was a meal that made a little feel like a lot. Red beans and rice was survival food with soul, steady, reliable, and loved by every generation. Cabbage and smoked sausage skillet was the meal that stretched to feed anyone who showed up hungry. A whole head of cabbage cooked down in a pan with sliced smoked sausage, onions, and a little grease turned into a full, hearty lunch. The cabbage softened, soaking up the smoky flavor of the meat until every bite was savory and rich. It was a one-pan wonder. No waste, no fuss, just warmth and satisfaction. This dish filled bellies on cold days and made the kitchen smell like home. It was food that welcomed people in, proof that generosity wasn't measured in wealth but in how far a meal could go. Cabbage and smoked sausage skillet was the definition of community cooking. Simple, soulful, and meant to be shared. The sizzle of sausage hitting the pan was the start of something comforting, a sound that said dinner would be all right. The meal carried laughter, conversation, and the kind of fullness that money could not buy. Even reheated, it was as good as new. Better, maybe, because the flavors grew deeper overnight. It was food that told the truth about love. Stretch what you have, share what you can, and feed whoever comes through the door. Fried sweet potato sandwiches were one of those clever meals that turned a single vegetable into something substantial. Sweet potatoes were sliced, fried in fat until browned, and then tucked between slices of bread, sometimes with a drizzle of molasses or mustard. The result was sweet, savory, and filling. Perfect for a quick lunch. Housewives liked the recipe because sweet potatoes were inexpensive, nutritious, and easy to grow in southern soil, making them dependable for large families. Children often enjoyed the sweetness, while adults valued the way the sandwich satisfied hunger without needing meat. Fried sweet potato sandwiches reflected a culture of thrift, using what was available to make meals hearty and flavorful. Though largely forgotten today, they once stood as proof that even a single vegetable could be transformed into a centerpiece of the table, carrying both nourishment and tradition with every bite served in mid-century kitchens. Which forgotten lunch would you pack again for your family? Share your memories in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe so we can keep bringing these midday traditions back to life.